Man, I don't know the cultural dynamics across all of the cultures, but when it comes to Islam, a man cannot demand a dowry. No matter how good looking you think you are, a man cannot demand a dowry. I don't think in all of our African cultures can a man say, look here, if you want to marry me, this is my price, this is the dowry you have to be willing to pay. But this is something which is a privilege for women. They can ask for the lobola, but it doesn't happen the other way around. In terms of Islam, most especially, a woman can ask for the privilege of demanding a certain dowry which is due to her. The other example, there is great honor attached to motherhood. Islam honors mothers to a great degree. A man can do all that he wants. He will not be able to achieve the great position of motherhood, which is exclusive to women. So that's why I'm saying there is a distinction between males and females. In most aspects, males and females are different. The scholars of Islam tell us there are only 3 aspects in which males and females are exactly the same. In only 3 aspects. The first is in terms of insaniya, in terms of the fact that they both are humans. That's the first element of commonality between males and females, commonality between males and females. The next is in terms of thawab, and the last is in terms of iqab. So in terms of thawab, the good deeds and the rewards that they will accumulate because of good deeds, that is same between males and females. And in terms of consequences for sins, it's also equal between males and females. But beyond these 3 elements, in most matters, there is a clear distinction between males and females, and that's the first distinction I want to create or want to mention before we commence with this discussion. The next distinction, which is of more relevance to today's discussion, and this distinction needs to be understood very well, and this distinction goes as follows. All men are males, but not all males are men. Let me repeat it again. All men are males, but not all males are truly men. And I'll give you an example to understand this. Allah in the Quran speaks about an incident of a particular leader by the name of Talut. And Allah says, فَلَمَّا فَصَلَ طَالُوتُ بِالْجُنُودِ Talut had departed with his army. And as he departed with his army, he was going towards Palestine for the liberation of the holy mosque in Palestine, Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Now he addressed his army. He said to the men who were going for this very important mission, or rather he said to the males who were going for this very important mission, he said, قَالَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ مُبْتَلِيكُمْ بِنَهَرٍ Allah is going to test you with a river. Now remember they're journeying. It's hot. In Arabia it's hot. In Jordan it's hot. It's hot. The nature of journey is it's difficult. They are now becoming thirsty. The river looks refreshing. As they're coming to the river, he says, فَمَنْ شَرِبَ مِنْهُ فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي Whoever drinks from the river, they will be expelled from the army. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَطْعَمُهُ فَإِنَّهُ مِنِّي إِلَّا مَنِ اغْتَرَفَ غُرْفَةً بِيَدِهِ Whoever has the self-restraint not to drink from the river, those people will have the right to remain in the army, with the exception of those who take 1 cup amount in their hand, and they just cup a little bit water in their hand and they take that sip. That will be the exception we are allowing. But those who drink from the river will be expelled from the army, and those who have self-restraint, they will remain within the army. So Talut had under his command 80,000, observe my choice of words, 80,000 males he had in his army. When he approached the river, people drank from the river, others abstained from the river. Eventually, after this exercise, which was a test from the Almighty Allah, after that, only 313 individuals remained in the army of Talut, while from the 80,000, the remainder were expelled. This is a filtration system of the Almighty, filtering the males from the men, because for this august mission, it needed real men. It couldn't just have ordinary males. And then Allah goes on in the Quran, speaking about the effectiveness of real men in comparison to just ordinary males, because this mission was actually successful. And Allah speaks about it saying, كَم مِّن فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةً كَثِيرَةً بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ How many times does a small group of real men become successful over a large group of males with the permission of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. My point that I'm driving is there is a distinction, and this distinction is vital. And the difference between men and males, there is a serious difference in terms of impact, in terms of outcome, when you have real men in comparison to real males. So I'm going to reiterate the statement. All men are males, but not all males are men. May Allah give us the understanding. From this first incident which I narrated, it became clear that masculinity is the internal possession of outstanding qualities. When the situation arises, and a person's qualities needs to be tested, and the qualities that come to the fore will then be a reflection of what qualities the person possesses, and possession of the right qualities is what masculinity actually is. Now let's try to put more meat to the skeleton definition we have of masculinity. You see in the Quran, Allah uses a word, dhakar, for males. The word in Arabic for a male is a dhakar. But in certain contexts, Allah does not use the word dhakar. Instead, Allah omits the word dhakar and Allah uses the word rajul. And then in other contexts, Allah doesn't use the word rajul, Allah then uses the word fatan. Now, even though they are all synonyms, they have a similar meaning. But why is there a distinction? Ulama say it's very clear when you study the Quran. That when Allah is referring to an ordinary individual, then Allah just uses the word dhakar. But when Allah is praising an individual, then Allah either uses the word fatan or Allah either uses the word rajul, telling us that dhakar is an ordinary male, a rajul is a real man, and a fatan is also a real man. So there's a distinction between the two. You guys get me? You with me, right? So fatan is the word used for an ordinary male. Rajul is used for a real man. A fatan is used for a real man. So what's the distinction between a fatan and a rajul? Because both of them are real men. A fatan is a real man in the early years of his life. And a rajul is a real man in the latter years of his life. So because of the nature of this particular program, our focus will more be on fatan than rajul. So from the word fatan, we hear the word futuwa, masculinity, real masculinity. And what is the definition of real masculinity? The first definition given by the scholars is futuwa fil khurasan. Remember I said, masculinity is not sloganism. Masculinity is not an outward appearance. Masculinity is not a claim. Masculinity is not a WhatsApp group you belong to. Masculinity is not your profile picture. Masculinity is not how many Andrew Tate videos you watch. Masculinity is the internal possession of qualities that manifest beautifully when the circumstances warrant it. So the first definition of masculinity given by the scholars is futuwa fil khurasan. Real masculinity among young men, where they are sublime real men, is in the lands of Khurasan. Now Khurasan is the lands of Afghanistan and that broader region. Why do they attribute real masculinity to that area? Let me give you a few reasons. In recent years, we know of 3 attempted invasions on Afghanistan. The first is when the British have invaded India and Pakistan. Then they wanted to expand their invasion and their colonization, and they attempted to invade Afghanistan. They attempted to invade Afghanistan and their attempts were unsuccessful. Then later on there was the attempted invasion by the Soviets, the mighty Soviet Union, and they tried to invade Afghanistan, but their occupation and their attempted invasion was also unsuccessful. And now in recent years, during most of our lifetime, we've seen the attempts by NATO led by America, spending billions of dollars over a span of 20 years, but they weren't able to deconstruct and occupy and they weren't able to invade Afghanistan, which tells us an important thing of Afghanistan. You know, there's a quote, people attribute it to different people, but from the past life, we came across this quote as being attributed to Rocky Balboa. He referred to Afghanistan as the graveyard of civilizations. Because if anybody tries to invade Afghanistan, you are bringing your civilization to a termination by attempting to invade Afghanistan. I'll tell you something else about Khorasan. You see, Sayyidina Rasul, the Imam Mahdi that Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke about, immediately when he surfaces in Makkah, he will have a small group of following, again around 300 people, and he won't be reinforced at this point. But when the news of the Mahdi's emergence spreads through the land, then the news will reach Khurasan, and a group of individuals carrying a black flag will then set out to reinforce the Mahdi. And after he receives this reinforcements, will the Mahdi become the force to reckon with. That's why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us that when we hear about this force going to reinforce to reinforce the Mahdi, then we should join, even if it requires that we crawl on ice. So the first definition of futuwa, real masculinity amongst young men, is we need to study the people of Khurasan, learn their qualities, imbibe those qualities, because that is masculinity amongst young people. There's another definition. You see, we could look into the Quran, and this is a more wholesome definition. You look into the Quran, and you see in which context does Allah use the word fatan. Which are the verses in which Allah uses the word fatan, and why is Allah using the word fatan to praise the masculinity of a young man? And Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami rahimahumullah, one of the outstanding muhaddiths, he did the study. And he cites 3 examples where the word fatan is used. The first one he cites is when Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam was traveling, and he had with him the young man whose name was Yusha bin Nun. And Yusha bin Nun was in the service of Musa alayhi salam, being mentored by Musa alayhi salam, learning from Musa alayhi salam. At this point, Allah speaks about this saying, وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِفَتَاهُ, when Musa said to his young, outstanding, real man, لَا أَبْرَحُ حَتَّى أَبْلُغَ مَجْمَعَ الْبَحْرَيْنِ أَوْ أَمْضِيَ حُقُبًا, I will not stop walking. And in our search to meet a knowledgeable individual, I will not stop walking, even if it means I walk to the point of the meeting of the 2 oceans, or I walk for 80 years. I will not stop walking in my pursuit to meet this knowledgeable man, to learn from a knowledgeable individual. I just want to, for the sake of curiosity, when Musa was in Egypt and he said he wants to travel to the meeting of the 2 oceans, where was he referring to? Meeting of the 2 oceans. I was waiting for that one. People love South Africa. It was actually in Morocco, the meeting of the 2 oceans. But thanks for that. So, I will not stop. I will walk from Egypt right until Morocco. Or I will walk for 80 years. And this young boy, by the name of Yusha bin Nun, was willing to walk alongside Musa alayhi salam for this entire journey. So that's the first example where Allah uses the word fatan to praise a particular individual. The next example, there is a story in the 15th juz of the Quran where Allah speaks about a group of individuals who weren't willing to follow the common practices of the people. They were willing to cause disruptions because they wanted to create a moral society. They were willing to abstain for the sake of a greater good. And these young people were staying away from the vice that everybody else was engaging in, and they went to sleep in a cave, and due to a miracle they slept for 300 years. Allah in reference to them says, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ نَبَأَهُمْ بِالْحَقِّ, we narrate to you their story, the true version of their story. إِنَّهُمْ فِتْيَةٌ آمَنُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ وَزِدْنَاهُمْ هُدًى. They were real men. They were real men. They believed in the Almighty, and as a result, the Almighty had increased them in guidance. So that's the second example mentioned in the Quran of real outstanding men. The third example, the Prophet Abraham, and I'm sure everybody in this room is acquainted with the Prophet Abraham, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. The people around him were worshipping idols. He wanted to highlight to them the illogical nature of turning to an object instead of turning to the Almighty. So the Prophet Abraham had then destroyed the idols, and when he destroyed the idols, they were now investigating to determine who was behind this action. And then Allah speaks about what had transpired, and Allah says, قَالُوا سَمِعْنَا, certainly we have heard, Fatan, a young man, يَذْكُرُهُمْ, talking about them, يُقَالُ لَهُ Ibrahim, his name is Ibrahim. So here when Allah refers to Ibrahim alayhi salam, Allah also uses the word Fatan, meaning a young, outstanding gentleman, a real man who possesses the real qualities of masculinity. That's the way Allah refers to the Prophet Ibrahim. So Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami, one of the great scholars, he studied these three instances. And he says across these three groups, there are certain sub-qualities which are prevalent in all three of these groups. But there are three primary qualities which are prevalent in all three of these groups. And what are these three qualities? The first is bravery, the second is loyalty, and the third is generosity. Let me repeat it. The first is bravery, the second is loyalty, and the third is generosity. Based on that, suffice to say that the Quranic definition of masculinity is any young man who possesses bravery, loyalty, and generosity can be considered as a real man in terms of the Islamic and Quranic definition of what a real man actually is. Everybody's still with me, right? Let's move on to the third definition. You see, after the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, during his era, masculinity was alive. There was an importance attached to masculinity. Men were behaving like real men. They possessed the qualities and the demands. So that was during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings be upon him. Then came the time of his khulafa. Then came the time of his deputies. During that era, which was 30 years, there also was no shortage of masculinity amongst the Muslim community. Later on then came the dynasty of Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. During that time there also wasn't much talk of a lack or an absence of masculinity. But after the time of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, the Muslims came under the leadership of the Abbasids. Now the Abbasids are from the family of Abbas radiallahu anhu. At this point, the level of masculinity in the Ummah had dropped. In the Muslim community as a society, the level of masculinity had dropped. And how was this manifest? This was manifest by the fact that by this point the Crusades had occupied the Holy Mosque in Palestine. Al-Masjid al-Aqsa was now under Crusade occupation. So that tells us the level of masculinity had decreased. Had there been real masculinity, then oppression wouldn't have been prevalent. Occupation and stealing of land wouldn't have been prevalent, because there would have been real men in the society who would resist those type of things happening. So the Abbasids now made an effort that we need to revive masculinity. What does it mean? How long am I speaking? 20 minutes. The Abbasids, they wanted to revive masculinity. So what they did is, now for the first time ever, they systemized a program of masculinity. Now in order to systemize a program of masculinity, the first important element that needs to be understood is that there's no buffer period between childhood and adulthood. When a person is a child, they are 13, 14, 15, 12, 13, 14, 15, whatever it may be. When they reach puberty, they've transitioned from childhood into adulthood. Teenagehood, adolescence, is a Western construct. It's a Western concept. Because when they speak about it, it's to extend childhood for a longer period. You know, I have difficulty, you come across a person who is in grade 11 and grade 12 in school. His beard is featuring on his face already. His voice is cracked. He has an Adam's apple. His biceps are protruding. But he does something wrong in school. They phone his mother to come in to deal with the problem. Now, at that age, he's an adult. So the important distinction from an Islamic perspective is that when a person reaches puberty, he transitions directly out of childhood into adulthood. There's no buffer period between childhood and adulthood where you're not accountable, you're not held responsible, you can delay your growth because it's still time to play. The time to play ends when a person reaches puberty, because now once he's reached puberty, he's ended. Abbasids created a program that whilst a person is in childhood and he's about to transition into adulthood, there is a few elements inculcated within him needs to be taught. And the first element they say is tarbiyah. Now I'll mention all of the elements and then we'll revisit these elements. The first they said is tarbiyah, which is nurturing. The second they said is ta'aleem, which is the learning of sacred sciences. The third, they said, is becoming service-orientated and becoming selfless. The fourth, they said, is to become proficient in sunnah physical activities. And the fifth, they said, is to learn a skill that would make an individual self-sufficient and financially independent. Let me repeat it again. The first is tarbiyah. The second was ta'lim. The third was to become khidmah-orientated. The fourth is to become proficient in sunnah physical activities. And the fifth is to learn a skill that makes a person financially independent. So let's look at the first one. How was tarbiyah achieved? Every young boy who is about to transition into adulthood, he needs to spend time in the company of an accomplished Muslim adult. And he needs to be nurtured by this accomplished Muslim adult. And this is not in reference to formal learning and teaching. It means traveling with them, learning from them, spending time with them, going to visit the sick with them, helping in crisis with them, visiting the cemetery with them, spending time with them for the purposes of inculcating good qualities. So at the heart of the qualities that he's meant to learn from this accomplished individual is to learn respect. What is the respect? Not to walk in front of an elder, not to sit down when greeting a superior, not to refer to a woman in a disrespectful manner, not to speak anyhow, not to raise your voice above your father. These are elements of respect that he ought to learn while spending time in the company of an accomplished, practicing, believing person. The second part of tarbiyah, which is very important, is to develop the quality of sidq. Sidq is integrity. Integrity where your heart, your words, and your actions are all in one line. There's consistency. You don't believe in something and behave differently and speak differently. It is all consistent. A person's values, a person's actions, and a person's words are all in one consistent line. That is integrity. You know, I once went to go see a house that was available to rent, and the person showing me around said to me, brother, when you move in, we'll maintain the garden. When you move in, we'll look after the pool. When you move in, we'll paint the house every now and then. So these promises were too good to be true. So the next day I said, let's meet again at the house. And this time I came with a paper and pen and said, listen here, all your promises we're going to write down and we're going to sign to it. So now when I brought the paper and pen and I said, write down, he said, brother, there's something you must know about me. I say, what's that? He said, my word is always very flexible. The absence of integrity. So spending time in the company of somebody who will mentor sublime qualities into an individual is an important part of masculinity, which we refer to as tarbiyah. The second element of masculinity is ta'lim, the learning of the sacred sciences. Now, we all do attend madrasa, perhaps because it's part of the routine and the process. But to learn Islamic sciences to the point where we develop a world view and an outlook on things which is motivated by Islam. So a person's decision-making processes are based on what will make Allah happy and what won't make Allah happy. That's his decision-making process. But that can only be acquired when a person exposes himself to the Islamic sciences. I encourage everybody here, you don't need to be a scholar, but the bare minimum from every individual is that we have to read the seerah. We have to read the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have to read the Quran in the language that you understand at least once. We have to be acquainted with the hadith. In our field of work, we have to know the rulings within that field of work. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu used to go into the marketplace, and those who were trading and didn't know the rules of trade, he would send them back to the mosque. Go learn the rules of trade before you start to trade. I'm going to highlight one example, because perhaps it's something that causes a lot of pain. But the level of literacy in the Islamic community is way too low. I'll give you one example, and it's an absolutely relatable example. So perhaps we're discussing if something is a halal or haram. And person A says, look, it's halal because of this reason. Person B says, no, it's haram because of that reason. Obviously, you always refer your questions to your scholars, but they're having a casual discussion, nothing official. Somebody says halal, somebody says haram. Eventually, this is highly relatable, guys. Eventually, one person will say, guys, it doesn't matter halal or haram. The main thing is The number one most abused hadith in the world, the main thing is, brothers, innamal a'malu binniyat, actions are judged by your intention. So fiqh in its totality, the principles of fiqh in totality is completely diminished to intention. So imagine a murderer does murder with a good intention. The question I'm asking you is that highlights to us the low level of Islamic literacy in our community. Very often we speak about complex issues that the Muslim community should be providing solutions to. And finally they say, look here, once we change our amal, everything will fall into place. Now, does Islam only encourage worship? Or does Islam provide practical solutions to real problems? But you guys get my point. The level of literacy is so low that when we're facing situations, we're not looking at it through the lens of the Quran and the Sunnah and the Seerah. We're looking at it at very surface level because of the low level of Islamic literacy. May Allah give us the ability to increase our knowledge base, inshallah. Imagine if we spent less time on TikTok, how much more would we know? If we spend less time scrolling through shorts, how much more would we know? Interesting enough, one of the greatest forms of procrastination is watching motivational videos. Because you could have been taking action in that time. Now you're watching motivational videos on how to take action when you actually could have been taking action. So the second element of masculinity is ta'aleem. The third element of masculinity is to become service orientated. Every great champion that lived in this world, his greatness is measured by his impact. His value is not measured by superficial. His value is not measured by how famous he was. But his true value is measured by how much of an impact he made on this earth. Each of us asks the question, how different was the world when I entered the world? And how different will the world be when I leave this world? What sort of a footprint or what sort of an impact am I going to have? On one occasion, there was a loud, disturbing sound in the city of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. So immediately the Sahaba, being real men that they were, they immediately started to saddle up their horses to go and investigate the reason for that disturbing sound. And as they saddled up their horses, they mounted their horses and they started to ride out of the city. As they were riding out, they seen a horse galloping back into the city, and it was the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the man of all men, coming back to reassure the community that everything has been seen to, there's nothing to worry about. I'm asking the youth in this congregation, in this gathering, how do you possibly sleep at night when a man old enough to be your grandfather is patrolling with the CPF to look after the houses? How do you sleep at night? How do you be comfortable at home when the water is closed in your area and there's a possibility there's an old lady who nobody took water to her house? How do you sleep at night when there's no electricity for days? And perhaps it's winter and some baby is feeling cold and we've done nothing about it. How do we sleep at night? The great disciple or the great follower of the Prophet Muhammad, Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, one of the most inspiring individuals, he used to hold himself to such a level of responsibility as the leader of the Muslims. At the time when Muslims were ruling 1/3 of the known world, he used to hold himself to such a level of responsibility. He was based in Saudi Arabia and he held himself to such a level of responsibility that he said, if a sheep gets devoured on the banks of the Euphrates River, Euphrates River is running in Syria and Iraq, not even in his own country. If a sheep gets devoured by a wolf on the banks of the Euphrates River, and that shepherd loses his sheep, I fear that the Almighty will take me to task on the day of judgment. That level of responsibility. Muhammad Ali, the boxer, used to say, the service you render to others is the rent you pay for your space on earth. And with real masculinity, a person should focus his service efforts to the vulnerable in society. Now, a Western outlook removes certain realities. By making men and women equal, we move certain nuances and certain realities. And that reality is that in a volatile situation, women are more vulnerable than men. Children are more vulnerable than adults. Elderly are more vulnerable than the young people. So when young men become service orientated, then their services should be focused at the protection of the women and the children of the society, because that's an important element of masculinity. May Allah give us the understanding. So the next part of tarbiyah, or the next part of masculinity was service, to become service orientated. The next element of masculinity is to become proficient in prophetic physical activities. There were certain physical activities that the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings be upon him, practiced on, and not only practiced on, there were certain that he also encouraged. So for a man to be a real man, and perhaps when you get a proposal, this is where you need to test whether he's a real man. If a man is a real man, he should be able to ride a horse. If a man is a real man, he should be able to submit somebody in a rush. If a man is a real man, he should be able to use a sword. If a man is a real man, he should be able to fire an arrow when doing archery. If a man is a real man, he should be able to swim. These were the prophetic physical activities that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ taught us. Now, there are contemporary versions of sports, and there are prophetic versions of sports. And there's a great distinction between the two. But they've written that any physical activity is void of any greater benefit than it is batil. Then it's a waste of time. So every sport or physical activity has to achieve a higher goal. There has to be a social element where it creates friendship. There has to be a physical element where it makes you stronger. There has to be a skills development element to it which makes you better at what you do. But a sport that you do shouldn't just be for the sake of fun, because there's no shortage of fun in our life. It has to achieve a higher purpose, and that's very important. We've seen in the Sunnah physical activities, there are so many benefits. When people are grappling, now one example you come across a lot is that people assume that if you do martial arts, it makes you violent. Actually, by doing martial arts, it gives you self-restraint. I'll give you an example. Very few people actually train martial arts. Majority of people, they say, hey, if I'm in a fight, boss, I feel the opposite party sorry. So we say, based on what? Based on what? Because when I'm angry, I just see red. When has the criteria for victory been the ability to see red? When I'm angry, all I see is black. I go insane. Since when is the ability to be victorious in a combat sport require for you to go insane? You'll gas out in a few seconds. But a person who has trained in martial arts, they say the maths are honest even if you are not. If I make a claim, I can beat somebody up. Once we go on to the maths will speak the truth whether my claim was authentic or not. So the math teaches a person self-restraint. People who are martial artists are much more reluctant to get into conflict because they know the true outcomes of conflict. They know their ability, they know their restrictions. They are much more well acquainted with it, and they know their self-restraint. I'm going to make a strong statement. There are more fights. There are more fights. Guys, listen to me very well. There are more fights at the soccer tournament than what there is at the martial arts tournament. Let me repeat that. There are more fights at the soccer tournament than what there is at the martial arts tournament, because of the culture that the sport comes with is very important to keep in mind. So to become proficient in sunnah physical activities is the next element of masculinity. And then the final element of masculinity taught by the Abbasids is that every young man transitioning from childhood into adulthood needs to acquire skills that will make him fight. Now I want to, just for the sake of introspection, ask all of us that after spending 12 years in an institution, sometimes spending more in the institution, and you prepare your CV, what real skills do you have to document on the CV to say this is the value I can actually add? You know, we have a problem of unemployment, but we have a bigger problem than unemployment. And I'm quoting the former president. Bigger problem than unemployment is the great number of unemployable people. Ask the business people. There are so many youth that you take in on compassionate grounds, but you have absolutely no idea what to do with the people. So we need to learn skills that make us financially independent. For a man to be a real man, he needs to be able to know welding, He needs to know carpentry. He needs to know coding. He needs to know graphic designing. He needs to know programming. He needs to know public speaking. For Allah's sake, he needs to know how to drop a CV to start off with. But a person needs to know skills that will make a person financially independent. The ability to make a sales pitch, the ability to make a proposal. All of these things are key for a person to be financially independent. We need to break certain cycles. You see, you get certain situations where the grandfather is zakatable. The father then becomes zakatable. The son is also zakatable. Which champion is going to emerge in that family? And he's going to break that cycle by acquiring the skills that will make him financially independent. There's so much of confidence. There's so much of self-motivation and self-worth in the ability to earn for yourself and provide for your family. A person who acquires skills, it's so valuable. Imagine a brother is married. He buys a ready-to-assemble shelf from Macro or any store, and he comes home and he says to his wife, "Babes, can you please assemble the shelf?" After that day, you are never wearing the pants in that house, boss. You know, one author who wrote on the subject of futua, he says what motivated him to write on the subject of futua. He says one of his musallis at his masjid, a contemporary scholar, American scholar, he says what motivated him to write on the subject and create an awareness of masculinity is that one female musalli at his masjid phoned him to say, "Last night we experienced a burglary, I'm requesting du'as, it was a bit of an ordeal." So he asked the sister, "What transpired?" Says, "Myself and my husband were asleep, were in bed. We heard some noise downstairs, and my husband woke me up and said, 'Please go check if everything is alright.'" The Sheikh said, "Ya Allah, from today I'm writing a book, creating an awareness on the reality of masculinity." So the last element of masculinity is that a person acquires such skills that makes a person financially independent. Let me repeat, the first part of it was that a person is tarbiyah, his nurturing of his internal qualities. The second is ta'lim, acquiring knowledge of the sacred sciences. The third is to become service orientated, khidmah orientated. The fourth is to become proficient in sunnah physical activities. And the fifth is to acquire skills that makes a person financially independent. Some historians tell us that when this program was implemented amongst the Abbasids, it was so effective that it produced champions of that community. And amongst the people were the products of the structured syllabus of masculinity was Sayyiduna Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahumullah. And Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahumullah went on to liberate Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Some historians say that he was a product of this program of masculinity. You see, the timing of this discussion is excellent. We had a very beautiful time. It's not meant for us to lose hope. But when Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa goes under occupation, it reflects a deeper problem. It reflects the absence of masculinity. Had there been a high level of masculinity in the Ummah, then no oppressor would consider invading Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa without the fear of the consequences of a man living in South Africa would actually do something about it. But with the absence of masculinity, are they able to do these type of things? But each time Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa went under occupation, this caused the realization in the Ummah for the revival of masculinity. And that revival of masculinity led to the liberation of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Remember, masculinity is not a once-off switch. Nobody is born with it naturally. It's a lifelong journey where a person is working on the qualities of real masculinity. In every instance, he's asking himself, am I behaving like a real man? Or am I not behaving like a real man? A few red flags in real men, and I'm going to close on this. The first is, when men are overly emotional in their reaction, that's a red flag for a real man. You ever wondered, why does Islam confer the right to issue talaqs to a man and not to a lady? Why? Because the expectation of the Sharia is that the man is supposed to be emotionally grounded, in control of his emotions. But when a man becomes overly emotional, he's not living up to the expectation of the Sharia. Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanwi rahimahumullah had said, make sure your emotions are governed by your intellect, and make sure your intellect is governed by that which pleases Allah. And the second red flag, very important, The second red flag is when a young man who's supposed to possess the qualities of masculinity is engaging in futility. Pornography is a red flag. Anything associated to pornography is a red flag. Sliding into every DM you see is a red flag. Not having self-restraint is a red flag. These are all red flags that real men should make sure we're staying away from. Sorry, one final thought comes to my mind and I'm going to close on this. What is the difference between futuwa and rujula? I said the Quran uses futuwa as masculinity and the Quran uses the word rujula for masculinity. What's the difference between the two? Rujula is in the latter years of a person's life. Futuwa is in the early years of a person's life. But still that definition is not conclusive. Why is the definition not conclusive? Because futuwa can extend till the age of 65. And rujula can start all the way from the time of puberty. So what's the difference between the two? Futuwa is masculinity in the early years of a person's life where he's energetic. He possesses the skill with the absence of wisdom. And rujula is a point when a person's energy levels decreases. He still possesses the qualities, but his energy levels have decreases and now he possesses wisdom. Now, is it an insult to the young man that he doesn't possess wisdom? Is it an insult to the elderly man that he doesn't possess energy? No. It is meant to work in a beautiful way, where the old man who possesses wisdom mentors the young man who doesn't yet acquire wisdom. And the energy of the young man coupled with the wisdom of the old man, if we put that recipe together, we will be a winning society. May Allah bless us with real masculinity. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.